Hello there. Today, I'd like to take you into the history of one of the most famous haute couture houses of all time, the House of Dior. In this softly spoken talk, we're going to take a look at the life of Christian Dior, who founded the house, explore some of his wonderful designs, and discover how his unique outlook on fashion set the world alight in the late 1940s. We'll then also take a look at the designers who have succeeded Christian Dior as creative directors and see how his influence has inspired them over the years, coming right through to the modern day. As usual, there will be a slideshow of images to accompany our talk. And for this slideshow, all of the images are going to be photographs that I took when I visited the V&A recently. The V&A Museum in London is currently running a wonderful Dior exhibition called Christian Dior, Designer of Dreams. And I am going to talk about that exhibition later because it's really amazing and well worth a visit. So, welcome to the creative and glamorous world of Dior. The founder of the House of Dior was Christian Dior, who was born in 1905 in Granville, which is a seaside resort on the northern coast of France. He lived at the Villa Les Rumbes, which is a big house overlooking the sea at Granville that was built in the sort of late 19th century. Christian Dior described it as quite an ugly house, but he also said, "I have the most tender and amazed memories of my childhood home. I would even say that my life and my style owe almost everything to its site and architecture." This is an interesting comment because when you look at the house from the outside, it has these rendered walls that are painted in a soft pink colour. It also has grey roof tiles. And if you know anything about the House of Dior, you'll know that soft pink and grey are really the house colours. Christian Dior took the colours of his childhood home in Granville and elevated them to high style through his couture house. He was also apparently inspired by the interior of the house, which had been decorated by his mother, Madeleine, and which apparently had a lot of Louis XVI style furniture. So lots of gilded Rococo type furnishings, quite sumptuous decoration. And this was another influence that he would take with him into his couture house. His mother also influenced him through her interest in gardening. She was a very enthusiastic gardener, and apparently the little Christian Dior, as a boy, used to trail around after her around the garden. And he sort of became her favourite child because he was the one who took an interest in the garden and sort of developed a shared passion for the garden with her. And again, this is an influence that we'll see time and time again in his collections, his love of gardens, his love of flowers. So his childhood home was a defining influence on Christian Dior and on his work. It's now a museum, actually, and you can visit the villa and the garden, and they tend to have some very interesting exhibitions on there. Granville itself also played its part in forming the creativity of the young Christian Dior, because every February the town held, I think it still holds, a carnival where everybody would get dressed up in their carnival costumes, and Christian Dior was taken to the carnival every year as a child, and he developed a passion for dressing up and for masquerades and fancy dress balls. The family actually moved to Paris when Christian Dior was about 5 years old, but they still holidayed in Granville so it remained a constant influence in his life. When he was in Paris, he was dazzled by the Belle Epoque life and culture that was going on in the city at the time. As he grew older, he became very interested in the bohemian nightlife and artist's life in Paris. And once he'd graduated from school, he actually asked his parents if he could study art because he wanted to become an architect. But his parents said no. His father was actually the heir to the Dior fertilizer industry, which had been growing for several generations and had made the Dior family a lot of money. And Monsieur Dior wanted his son to take up a respectable middle-class profession, and art was out of the question. So Christian enrolled at the Institute of Political Science in Paris, and the idea was that he would study there to become a diplomat, which was a very prestigious and middle-class profession, the sort of thing his father approved of. However, because they'd said no to him studying art, his parents did relent enough to allow Christian to study music on the side. He took extra classes in music composition because he'd studied music since he was a boy, and they thought this would be a nice compromise that would allow him to maintain a creative element in his life while he was studying to become a diplomat. But through his musical studies, he fell in with a young composer called Henri Sauguet, and he was something of a bohemian. Sauguet was connected to a group of quite experimental musicians who were known as Les Six, and through Sauguet and through these other composers, Christian Dior met all kinds of interesting radical creatives, such as the poet Max Jacob and the artist Christian Berard, who would become a great friend of Christian Dior's, and who was also a good friend of Jean Cocteau, the centre of Bohemian Paris. So Christian Dior began to lead a sort of double life. During the day he was studying, supposedly, to become a diplomat, and at night he was part of Christian Berard's circle. Berard was famous for the parties he threw, the masquerade parties and costume parties, and Christian Dior was always being roped in to design and create costumes for these because he was very talented at it. However, at this stage in his life, in his early 20s, he didn't really think about having a career as a fashion designer. Once it became clear that he really had no aptitude or interest for becoming a diplomat, he left the Institute of Political Science, and he managed to persuade his father to let him open an art gallery with his friend Jacques Bonjon. His father wasn't overly pleased, but he did actually fund the art gallery for his son. So the gallery opened. It didn't have Christian Dior's name on it because his mother couldn't bear the idea of the Dior name being on a shop front. So it was the Galerie Bonjon. It was his friend's name that went on the business. But between them, they held a lot of very, very interesting exhibitions, and they showcased the work of some artists who would go on to become very important in the art world. Chalychev, Emilio Terry, Joan Miro, Leonore Fini. If you're interested in 1930s art and in the neo-romantics, you'll know these names. They all exhibited at Christian Dior's gallery, and so did Jean Cocteau and Christian Berard as well, of course. This was a time when the boundary between the world of artists and the world of high society was beginning to blur slightly in Paris. some high society members were beginning to take an interest in the bohemian world of Paris. And you had society hostesses like Natalie Paley and Marie-Laure de Noailles, who they sort of courted the bohemian artists. They wanted to associate with them. They became their patrons. Consequently, this bohemian artistic world became very, very fashionable. And a lot of creative careers were enabled through the patronage of these high society doyens. This is important because it was actually Christian Dior's friends and his contacts that would later help him when he was opening his fashion house. He was said to be quite a shy person. He wasn't a larger-than-life creative figure. He was quite quiet, quite reticent, and he was apparently a very loyal friend, very affectionate, very steadfast in his friendships, and that endeared him to a lot of people. His friends would become increasingly important to him because in 1929, after the great Wall Street crash, his father's financial situation started to decline. His father had invested quite heavily in property, and his investments turned out poorly. By the early 1930s, his fortune was all but gone. Christian Dior's art gallery had to close in 1932, and he became very poor indeed, and he ended up sort of sharing digs with friends, and he was basically living in a very hand-to-mouth way, and his friends helped him out. In 1934, he actually contracted tuberculosis, and his friends rallied round to help pay for his treatment, and they also sent him away on a cure. Once he'd recovered, they also set about helping him find work, and one of his friends, Jean Ozanne, who actually became an actor later on in his life, but at this time in the 1930s he was working as a fashion illustrator. Ozanne offered him a room in his apartment, and while Christian Dior was living there, he started to draw too. He'd always been interested in art and drawing, and with Ozanne's guidance, he started to develop his talent. He became a very talented illustrator, and so then Ozanne got him some work. He used his contacts in the fashion industry to get Dior some work with the magazine Le Figaro, and he was also able to sell some of his sketches to some of the Paris fashion houses. His talent as a designer soon became apparent, and in 1937 he was offered a job at the Haute Couture house that belonged to Robert Piguet. And it's probably worth here just explaining a little bit about what an haute couture house was, still is. Haute couture it's a very specific type of fashion design. It's strictly regulated, and in order to call itself an haute couture house, a business has to follow very specific rules. For example, their clothes have to be made to order for individual clients. The business has to have a workshop, atelier, in Paris, and it has to employ a certain number of staff full-time, and it has to present a collection of original designs to the public twice a year. So it's a very prestigious form of dressmaking, in effect. It's the pinnacle of the tailoring and fashion business. And consequently, there aren't that many haute couture houses in existence. There were more in the 1930s than there are now, and Robert Piguet owned one back then. He employed Christian Dior in his couture house, where Dior found himself working alongside Pierre Balmain and Marc Bohan, who would both go on to become very well-known designers. However, his career in haute couture was interrupted by World War II. He went back to Granville to do his military service. And just as a side note, it's worth mentioning here that Christian Dior had a very, very interesting sister called Catherine. During the war, she actually became a member of the French resistance. She worked for the resistance all through the war until she was captured in 1944. She was arrested by the Gestapo, interrogated, and then she was deported to the Ravensbrück concentration camp, which must have been incredibly terrifying. But she did survive, and she came home in 1945. There aren't many people who realise that the designer Christian Dior had this remarkable sister, so her story is worth looking up. Christian Dior himself returned to Paris in 1942. He went back to the world of couture and he worked for the couturier Lucien Lelong, who also had a haute couture house in Paris at that time. He found himself working again with Pierre Balmain, who had also moved from Piguet to Lelong. And Balmain then actually moved again in 1945. He left Lelong because he wanted to open up his own haute couture house. And perhaps it was this that inspired Christian Dior to think about going out on his own. But he didn't. He stayed with Lelong, where he had a very successful career. And it wasn't until after the war had finished that he decided it was time to set up his own couture house. Again, his well-connected friends really helped him out here because one of them introduced him to Marcel Boussac, who was a textile millionaire. He was known as the Cotton King, and he agreed to bankroll Christian Dior in the opening of a new couture house. And of course, Dior had the encouragement and the enthusiasm of all his high society patrons as well, who were encouraging him to open the business and who were ideally placed to spread the word about this exciting new haute couture business. So he had the contacts, he had the money, he certainly had the talent. And so finally the House of Dior was opened in December 1946 at a little house at 30 Avenue Montaigne. Dior's first fashion collection came out in February of 1947, and it was called Corolla in English, which is the term for the circle of petals that one gets in a flower. This idea of the corolle was very central to Dior's designs, and of course it was inspired largely by the garden of his youth, by his mother's passion for flowers, and he used this concept as a way of bringing together all his ideas about fashion and about women's style. And at this time, in the mid to late 1940s, just after the war, women's fashion was very, very practical. It had to be, because there'd been a war and women had been working in huge numbers. There'd also been a lot of rationing, and fabric was one of the things that was rationed. So clothes had become very utilitarian and quite drab fabrics because that was all that could be got. Christian Dior had this dream of women as flowers. He wanted to design clothes for women that turn them into these gorgeous flowers, these blooms, with bright colours and big full skirts that were very long and sweeping and had yards and yards of fabric in them. They were very feminine, these clothes. They had very nipped-in waists. They had a very soft shoulder line, which was a real change from the shoulder line at the time, which was quite boxy. This Carole collection just took the fashion industry by storm. Thanks to his connections in the industry, all the press had turned out to see his first collection. Carmel Snow, who was the editor of American Harper's Bazaar, was there, and she was totally swept away by Christian Dior's first collection. And she said to him afterwards, "It's such a new look." And this phrase, new look, became synonymous with the collection and with Christian Dior's clothes. This new silhouette caused a sensation. These beautiful, rich fabrics caused a sensation. And not everybody loved it, it has to be said. It was quite a controversial look, which is interesting with hindsight, because when you look at Dior's early designs now, you can see that they're actually quite historical. The nipped-in waists, the corseted bodices, the big full skirts that come almost down to the ankle. I mean, they're like something from a different age. They're like something from the age of Marie Antoinette. He was harking back to that Louis XVI style that his mother loved so much. But although his designs were, in that sense, very traditional, they were very, very unconventional by mid-1940s standards. And the amount of fabric they used, especially, given that material was still being rationed, caused riots in places. Some of Christian Dior's models who were taken out into the street to be photographed in the clothes were actually attacked because these clothes were just considered to be outrageous. It was outrageous to use that much fabric and to flaunt that much luxury when ordinary people were still being rationed and still had very, very hard lives. But in spite of this, high society loved his clothes. They loved the return to luxury and opulence. And the gorgeous fabrics that Dior used and the intricate embroidery was a huge hit with wealthy couture customers. Dior was particularly enthusiastic about designing evening wear, probably because of his childhood passion for carnival and masquerade. He once said that a ball gown is your dream, and you must make it your dream. And he certainly did. He designed several absolutely stunning evening gowns. There's one in particular that I absolutely love, which is called Junon. It's named after the Roman goddess Juno. And it's a white silk dress. It has a fairly simple bodice, and then it has this huge tulle skirt which falls in petals, and every petal is embroidered with iridescent blue, copper, purple, and sort of peacock green sequins. And it is a dream of a dress. It looks like something that Titania, Queen of the Fairies, might wear. It's a stunning piece, and like all of his dresses, actually underneath the filmy exterior, it's a feat of engineering because it's highly structured. The bodice is pretty much a traditional corset. It's full of boning. And then the skirt has layers and layers of petticoats to make it sort of stand out in that dreamy way. Unsurprisingly, Margot Fonteyn, the ballet dancer, was an early enthusiast for Dior. She wore a lot of his evening gowns, and he was also courted by film stars. Marlene Dietrich was a very early convert to Dior, and Rita Hayworth also wore a lot of his designs, and so did Ava Gardner. So he became associated with this very, very glamorous clientele. His association with movie stars opened up a new market for him in America. And his business partner, Jacques Rouet, encouraged him to visit America. Dior was a bit nervous about it first, but he went and he really enjoyed himself. And he decided, with Rouette's encouragement, to diversify his business. He opened up a showroom in New York. And the other thing that Dior decided to do at the same time was launch a perfume, which would carry the Dior name and bring a little bit of Dior glamour to a wider market. He called it Miss Dior, and the story goes that he named it after his sister Catherine, who'd been so brave during the war. Dior also started licensing other products, silk ties, hosiery, handbags, furs. And through this licensing business, Dior became a worldwide name. Branches opened up in Cuba and Tokyo, and eventually in the UK. Princess Margaret, who was the Queen's younger sister, commissioned Dior to design a 21st birthday gown for her in 1951. And this gives you an idea of just how famous and powerful really Dior had become, not just in fashion circles, but in high society circles, which, given that he was quite a quiet and shy man, must have been quite extraordinary for him. He had never been an enfant terrible. He hadn't even started his couture business until he was in his early 40s. And now, within a very few short years, he was not only the toast of Paris, but the toast of fashionable society everywhere around the world. This fame probably also brought a certain amount of pressure with it. His collections continued to be incredibly successful. Everybody wanted him, everybody wanted his clothes. He appeared on the cover of Time magazine in March 1957. Christian Dior Mania was really at its peak by the mid to late 50s. However, sadly, the stress that came with this incredible rise to fame proved to be too much for Christian Dior, and in October of 1957 he died of a heart attack. Everyone who worked for him at Avenue Montaigne was absolutely devastated. He was incredibly well liked by his staff. They all adored him. When he died so suddenly, the House of Dior was plunged into grief. Jacques Rouet wanted to close down the business because the idea of the House of Dior carrying on without Christian Dior seemed impossible. Perhaps, ironically, it was the very fact that he and Dior had branched out into so many licensing arrangements that actually compelled Rouet to keep the business going. Because, of course, all the industries who had Christian Dior licenses wanted to keep selling the products. And so Rouet was persuaded to keep the couture business going, because that was at the heart of the Christian Dior brand. And a new creative director was appointed to head the couture house. This was a young man who Christian Dior had first spotted and employed when he was only 19 years old, because Dior saw him as a great talent. He was now just 22 years old, and at that very young age he found himself as the head couturier of the House of Dior, and his name was Yves Saint Laurent. That, of course, is now a very, very famous name in haute couture. But Saint Laurent began his career at Dior, and he remained its creative director for 3 years, from 1957 to 1960. He had to leave in 1960 because France had compulsory military service at that time, and Yves Saint Laurent was called up. The next creative director for Dior was Marc Bohan, who had known Christian Dior since the 1930s. He'd actually been working for Dior since 1958. He was the head designer at the London House of Dior. With his appointment as creative director, he moved back to Paris, and he continued at the House of Dior for 29 years. He saw the House of Dior right through the 60s. He continued to design very luxurious, very opulent, stylish clothes with an emphasis on gorgeous evening wear. And he also kept the Dior ship steady when it went through financial difficulty in the 1980s after the Broussac business empire collapsed and the House of Dior was sold off. It was purchased by the company of Arnault, who heads an incredibly large luxury goods empire now. And when Marc Bohan finally left Dior in 1989, Arnault really shook things up at the company by employing an Italian to be the new creative director of the couture house. This was considered to be something of an outrage at the time, because until that point every designer for Dior had always been French. But Arnault chose Gianfranco Ferré to be the new director, and personally I feel that it was a good choice. Gianfranco Ferré had studied to be an architect, which I always feel Christian Dior would have liked because, of course, architecture was the thing he wanted to study all those years ago when he'd first left school. Gianfranco Ferré understood that the House of Dior was all about glamour, luxury, and also femininity. He designed really gorgeous evening wear for Dior. And his first collection for the house, which was the Autumn-Winter 1989 collection, was actually inspired by the designs of Cecil Beaton, who had created the ascot costumes for the film My Fair Lady. And if you know that film and you can recall the ascot scene, then you know that it features some delightful Edwardian-inspired costumes that are all black and white and very, very chic. And Cecil Beaton himself had been a big admirer of Christian Dior, and I can't help but feel that this first collection was a great tribute to Dior, even though it was inspired by Cecil Beaton's designs and not by Dior's designs. Cecil Beaton himself had been inspired by that Belle Epoque Edwardian high society look when he created the costumes for My Fair Lady. And of course that look, that era, was the era of Christian Dior's own mother. And that very feminine, very high society Belle Epoque look was something that I think he would have loved. It was a gorgeous collection, mainly in black and white, as a tribute to the black and white ascot scene. The tailoring was absolutely beautiful. There's one particular coat called the match coat, which is a black and white houndstooth check coat, very much in the Dior style. And it's a beautifully draped piece. It's the sort of coat which would make any woman look amazing, I think. Ferré stayed at Dior until 1996, and then the role of creative director was taken by John Galliano. He was a much younger designer, and by 1996 he was working as the creative director at Givenchy. His move to Dior was considered to be very auspicious because he took over in 96, which was of course the 50th anniversary of the house first opening. And his first assignment for Dior was actually to create a gown for Princess Diana, the Princess of Wales, who was attending the 1996 Met Gala in New York. The big exhibition they were having that year was about Christian Dior. It was celebrating the 50 years of the house, and he designed a navy satin slip dress for her, which I seem to recall really shocked the UK press at the time, because it does look a bit like a nightdress. It's a beautiful dress, but it's a very simple slip with a lace edging, and it does look a bit like a nightie. And that was considered to be not the sort of thing that a royal princess should wear at the time, but times have changed. Galliano's designs are very unique. They have immense opulence, immense character, incredible artistry, and they tend to be very, very theatrical. Galliano actually worked as a dresser at the National Theatre in London while he was a student, and it kind of shows in his collections. Some of his designs are breathtakingly beautiful. When he's at his best, he uses his theatricality and his artistry to amazing effect, creating clothes that are just dreams. One of my favourite couture dresses of all time is one designed by him. It's called the Harlequin Gown. He created it in 1998, and it's clearly based on Harlequin and Columbine costumes of the Italian Commedia dell'arte. But it's just exquisite in the way it's been created. However, the theatricality of Galliano's designs does sometimes lapse almost into pantomime. He always designs clothes that look great on a catwalk, but when you see some of his designs close up, things that look amazing on the catwalk or in a magazine look a bit like, I don't know, costumes for a pantomime dame. They're sort of overdone. And I think Galliano does this because he's an artist and he wants to push the boundaries and he wants to explore what he wants to explore, which is fair enough. But some of his designs are a bit borderline caricature. They're more concept pieces than something that suits the female form. Nevertheless, John Galliano's time at Dior was very, very successful, and I think he probably would have stayed there longer, but unfortunately he was caught up in a horrible controversy. He made some really quite ghastly anti-Semitic comments and was sacked from Dior. He was then replaced by Ralph Simon, a Belgian designer. He'd previously been working as a designer at Jill Sander, and he had a real reputation for minimalism in his clothes, which of course isn't really what you think of when you think of the House of Dior. Nevertheless, he spent 3 years working for Dior, and while he was there, he did produce some really exquisite designs. He did what all designers who work at Dior do. He went back and looked at Dior's original interests, original inspirations, and he did use these to create some really exceptional pieces. Dior's love of history and of Louis XVI style came out in a dress that he designed called the Look 8 dress, which looks a lot like an 18th century court dress, really, and is made from the most beautiful embroidered silk, which was inspired by the Spitalfields silk industry in 18th century London. He also created some amazing ball gowns which had very severe minimalistic black turtleneck tops, but then had huge ball gown skirts covered in flowers that were made in the most incredible shimmering fabrics, and I think Christian Dior would have loved them, actually. But Simon moved on in 2015 to focus on his own designs. And since 2015, the House of Dior has been headed by Maria Grazia Chiori, who worked for many years at Valentino. She was the first woman to head the House of Dior, And she created a very, very interesting interpretation of Christian Dior's bar suit. The bar suit is a famous Dior design. It was part of his original New Look collection, the Carole collection, and it features a nipped-in cream tailored jacket over a very, very big black skirt. And the jacket itself is highly structured. It's boned on the inside, and it trims the model's waist down to 19 inches, which is just tiny. When you see the bar suit in the flesh, it's almost incredible, the hourglass shape it creates with this tiny waist and then this very, very full skirt. And this design is considered to be one of the key Christian Dior looks. It's a design that is said to encapsulate everything about the new look. And every designer who has taken over at the House of Dior since then has always created their own version of the bar suit as a sort of tribute to Christian Dior. Gianfranco Ferre created one. Galliano created more than one. And there always a variation on the original suit with the cream jacket and the black skirt. Chiori's interpretation of the bar suit when she took over was really very interesting because she's created an outfit with the long black skirt and the cream jacket, but it's a very unstructured design. It's very pared down. It's very easy to wear. It's not particularly glamorous. And in her version, she leaves the jacket buttons open. So rather than creating a nipped-in waist, the waistline is actually quite flowing and relaxed. And underneath the jacket, there's a Slogan T-shirt. And this is something that Chiori is known for, her Slogan T-shirts. She wasn't the first designer to do it, of course, because Catherine Hamnett was doing it back in the 80s. But she designed a range of these T-shirts, and one of them featured the title of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's essay, "We Should All Be Feminists." And this was the T-shirt that she chose to pair with the bar suit, which was a really interesting choice, I felt, because when Christian Dior first launched the new look in the late 40s, he was heavily criticised, not just by French women who objected to his use of opulent fabrics at a time of rationing, but also by feminists who felt that his corseted bodices and his big skirts with lots of layers of petticoats were kind of taking women back to a less powerful time and were a retrograde step for women. He wasn't designing the sort of clothes that were easy to wear. He wasn't designing the sort of clothes that could be worn actually by working women. They were far too impractical and uncomfortable. And so feminists of the time did criticise him. So it's rather ironic and kind of wonderful in a way that Maria Grazia Chiori has created this version of the bar suit with this feminist Slogan T-shirt. It kind of brings the Dior story full circle in a way. But in spite of this rather radical interpretation of the bar suit, her other designs for Dior do follow many of the House of Dior traditions. The influence of the garden, the influence of history, all those ideas are embedded in her collections. There's one particularly stunning evening gown that she's created called Jardin Fleuri, which is actually made with tiny pieces of dyed feather, but from a distance it looks like a dress made of flowers. And she's also designed a rather lovely dress, numero 34 it's called, which is inspired by medieval tapestries and the millefleur background that you get in a lot of medieval tapestries. So that is very much an example of how she's used the traditions of Dior and interpreted them in her own way. Another dress that she's designed and which you can see in the V&A exhibition that's currently running is the Your Chances dress, which was inspired actually by a 1950s fan that was produced by the House of Dior as a sort of promotional gift. And she's taken the signature of Dior that was on this fan and applied it to this amazing pink tulle dress. And that is the final design that you see in the current Dior exhibition at the V&A. And it's a very fitting finale to what is an absolutely stunning exhibition. It's just been extended until the beginning of September 2019. So if you're listening to this between now and then and you have a chance to get to London, then I would thoroughly recommend going to see this exhibition. It's actually based on an exhibition that started life in Paris in 2017, which I actually did try and get into because I was in Paris in 2017 and I stood in a huge queue for hours trying to get in to see the Dior exhibition. And I failed. I couldn't get in. But I managed to see it in London, which was amazing. And the exhibition looks at all the various themes that ran through Christian Dior's work, the garden, history, all the themes we've been talking about. And it dedicates a room to each of these themes and to Dior's interpretations of them, and also to the interpretations by the designers who came after Dior. And they're stunning, these rooms. They've been beautifully curated. The Diorama Room is curated by colour and shows designs by Christian Dior and the other designers at the House of Dior through a colour palette ranging from green to blue to purple to red to pink to orange, and it's a stunning room. It features dresses, coats obviously, but it also features shoes and hats and jewellery and some amazing miniature dresses as well. After this you come into the Dior Ballroom, which is the most incredible room. It's full of gorgeous glittering evening gowns, and it features a fantastical light show which is constantly changing and really shows off the dresses to best effect. It's a really magical room. As you've probably gathered, I really loved this exhibition. If you're a fan of haute couture or fashion at all, or you're interested in the history of fashion and the impact it has on society and social norms, it's definitely worth a view. So that concludes this history of the House of Dior, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to it, and I hope you can join me again soon for another softly spoken audio adventure. I look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, goodbye.